Thank you very much. Thank you very much, George. Far, far too kind. So now we are coming up to the 20th anniversary of the invasion of Iraq, which 36 million people across 3,000 demonstrations globally protested against. The occupation displaced 1 in 25 Iraqis and killed, as has been said, over 1 million people. Since then, the US has spent $32 million an hour on war. In fact, the war on terror, which spanned 20 years, entailed on average 46 bombs being dropped per day by the US forces and their allies. It led to 37 million people being displaced. And in fact, the very year that the war on terror began in 2001, you saw 33 million classified actions carried out by the US government. And that year alone, the US government spent $5.5 billion to keep classified documents secure. In fact, as Peter Gallison puts it in his book, Agnotology, The Making and Unmaking of Ignorance, the classified universe is certainly not smaller and is very probably much larger than the unclassified one. And there was, for me, an incident which actually encapsulated the meaning of the war on terror, on that great transfer of wealth. Eric Prince, the founder of Blackwater, the notorious military contractor, as people were fleeing from Afghanistan with the British and the US occupation, Eric Prince was charging $6,500 per seat for Afghans who hoped to fly out of Kabul with him. That is what this is all about. There are winners of these wars, from Lockheed Martin to BAE Systems to Raytheon. These are companies which have seen in the last year the price of shares in their companies increase up to 40%. And in fact, the war on terror led to an 1,200% increase in the price of shares in Lockheed Martin. Those are the winners here. But there's another British company who some of us may not have heard of. It goes by the name of Kinetic. And actually, it relates to a particular figure within our political class. The very month that Minister of Defence Ben Wallace was voted into Parliament, he resigned from his job as a director of Kinetic. Now, Kinetic, as an arms technology company, gained in 6 months of the Ukraine war alone £800 million in sales. In addition to that, one of the directors of the Defence Reform Advisory Board to Ukraine, which was established in 2016, is Gordon Messenger, who simultaneously is a director of Kinetic. And now, guess what? A few days ago, Kinetic leaked out on their website that they were participating in a Ministry of Defence testing of suicide drones specifically for Ukraine. They were one of 5 participant companies, and they were the only one to leak out that news. They promptly, once it was reported, deleted the post from their website. So what we actually know is that our Defence Secretary is the former director of a company which is benefiting massively from the war in Ukraine, that benefited massively from the war in Afghanistan, even while he was a director of it. These are the type of deals which exist in our political class. Now, to zoom out from that micro to the macro a little bit more, I think we have to be clear that the type of weapons that are being sent to Ukraine by 28 different countries around the world, all of them with the exception of Australia, Canada and the US, European, would take a long time to train the Ukrainians how to use. There was much weaponry which was bestowed upon the Afghan army, which they were never trained how to use. We even see talk now of armor-piercing depleted uranium ammunition being sent. So, in essence, what is being established in Ukraine is a laboratory for these arms companies in which tests can take place and then better be applied to the quote-unquote global market. So what have we seen? We've seen, according to estimates in December, 100,000 troops on each side die. We've seen over 50% of the energy infrastructure directly impacted in Ukraine. We have seen at least $3 billion being required per month to keep the Ukrainian economy afloat. And guess who has come to the rescue? None other than the IMF and the World Bank, of course. Nearly 14 million Ukrainians have been displaced. And we also know that 40% of the population will require humanitarian assistance. And actually, what you've seen through the sanctions policy is Russia's economy contract far less than the economy of the Ukraine or of the UK. You see the Ukrainian economy contract by 35% in 2022 alone. What we also know is that as a counterweight to the United States, you've seen China, Russia, India trade in currencies other than the dollar. This will have significant consequences for the United States. And even Iraq, the very country that the United States invaded 20 years ago, yesterday announced that it had agreed to trade with China in currencies other than the dollar. And one of the other big lessons from this war is that, yes, the United States has consolidated its military supremacy in Europe. And let's be clear, this is not a sovereign country. You have 12,000 US troops in this country. This time last year, at the beginning of the war, you saw the US spend £3 billion in this country alone to expand its military and intelligence operations. But you know who else has agreed to trade with China in currencies other than the dollar? None other than Saudi Arabia. Let's be clear, the United States has lost the Gulf. They've lost the rest of the world. They've consolidated their power in Europe, but they have lost the rest of the world. And an interesting case study to look at to understand this is Sky News. So Sky News, during the occupation of Afghanistan, had a foreign news editor by the name of Lorna Ward. Lorna Ward was simultaneously the foreign news editor of Sky News and simultaneously an advisor to General Adrian Bradshaw, the deputy commander of NATO in Afghanistan. But how many of us know about the case of Sky News Arabiya? So this is the Sky News branch which is based in the UAE. Many of us would think this would be parroting NATO propaganda. You know what? It isn't. It has a show called Min Moscow, which is presented giving a point of view which has a clear, critical analysis of the war in Ukraine. And in fact, Saudi Arabia's economy has benefited more than any other through these sanctions on Russia. Another point to remember is that even while those in Turkey are struggling to get to their feet from the earthquake, their key provider of wheat was Russia. So actually the sanctions upon Russia and the preventing of Turkey from being able to import wheat from Russia is hurting Turkey's ability to stand back on its feet from the earthquake. But what can we say of infallible Saint Zelensky, the green screen champion, an ambassador for Lockheed Martin and the military-industrial complex? He's a small man. His government has imposed some of the world's most aggressive anti-worker policies, and in fact, the legislation that he has passed deprive around 73% of workers of their right to union protection and collective bargaining. You even have US government-funded bodies like Solidarity Center of the AFL and CIO, Labour Federation, condemning what Ukraine has done. So Ukraine currently is subject to a sharp shock therapy. It is the very same type of neoliberal shock therapy that was applied to the Russian Federation in the early 90s, which even UNICEF actually estimated was responsible for 3.2 million excess deaths. That's right, even UNICEF directly put its finger on the neoliberal policies which harm people. But I tell you, in this country, it is of no coincidence that Boris Johnson played a key role in scuppering the peace deal. But today he is applying for the Secretary General of NATO. Do we believe that is a coincidence? That he provided that key service at that very critical juncture of the war to stop negotiations and to stop the possibility of peace. And today he wants to be the Secretary General of NATO. And what can we say of Keir Starmer and his war against anti-war figures in this country? Well, we can't forget that Keir Starmer is funded by none other than Clive Hollick. Who is Clive Hollick? He is a director of the Honeywell International Company. Now, Honeywell claims to have hardware in every single military aircraft in the world today. Keir Starmer is part of the Start the War coalition. So what you have seen is while Ukraine's economy has shrunk by 35% or more, Saudi Arabia's economy has increased by, its GDP has grown by 8.7%. You know who else has gained out of this war? ExxonMobil. They made $57 billion. Shell made $40 billion. Chevron and Total each earned $36 billion in 1 year. And BP, even while it pulled out of Russia, still made $28 billion. And it's rare that I would quote somebody I dislike as much as Emmanuel Macron, but I think there's wisdom in what he says. He said, in today's geopolitical context, among countries that support Ukraine, there are two categories being created in the gas market. There are those who are paying dearly and those who are selling at very high prices. The United States is a producer of cheap gas that they are selling at a high price. I don't think that's friendly. And he's right. Macron is right. The United States is not an ally of European countries. And when we look at the other behemoths of US imperial power, like Lockheed Martin and Northrop Grumman, they have seen massive growth in the price of their shares. Northrop Grumman actually touching 41% in increased value from this war. And it's not just Turkey that is harmed by the impediment to the importing of Russian or Ukrainian wheat. Actually, 15 African countries import more than half of their supply of wheat traditionally from both Russia and Ukraine. We are seeing suffering around the world off the back of these needless, sadistic policies. Now, in the case of Ukraine, it's important to be clear that the year of the Iraq War, a body was established in Ukraine by the name of the Ukraine NATO Civic League, or the NATO-Ukraine Civic League. Now, what did this organization entail? It entails around 50 NGOs, and those NGOs worked specifically on the purpose of promoting the Euro-Atlantic European NATO course for Ukraine, to astroturf within Ukrainian society the idea that membership of NATO was a necessity. Well, let me ask you a question. The 20 years of NATO occupation in Afghanistan not only led to 250,000 people dying, it led to Afghans being statistically rendered the saddest people in the world. Was NATO presence in Afghanistan good for Afghan people? Clearly not. When you look at Libya, you saw in the space of 6 months, NATO bombed Libya 7,700 times. And today you have Libyans struggling to get out of the country and drowning at sea, where NATO governments look on with shallow, callous indifference. And now NATO is pivoting. It is pivoting towards China. And it must be said very clearly that when you are talking about China, you are talking about 1/5 of the world's population. That is 1.4 billion people. NATO has absolutely no business in Taiwan or anywhere near to China. But what they are attempting to do is resist the natural pendulum of history. In the 1600s, when the East India Company was founded, Britain produced just 1.8% of the world's GDP. At that time, India and China actually accounted for 75% of the world industrial output. Now, what you saw is between 1750 and 1900, through imperial adventure, Britain increased its per capita GDP by 347%. In this relatively short period of human history, economic power became concentrated in a small part of the world's population. And actually, that's quite the aberration of history. History has not always been that way. China was the largest is the largest still existing polity in the world, over 2,000 years old. And as a civilization, it's actually 4,000 to 5,000 years old. And there were 4 to 5 different periods of human history when China was the most advanced country in the world. It had steel production 1.5 millennium before England. It had printed press 0.5 millennium before England. Cheng Ho sailed the sea in more advanced ships long before Da Gama and Columbus. Let's be clear, Britain's industrialization was based on the prevention of other societies' development, and without colonies, this small island of limited resource could not have achieved its economic takeoff in the way that it did. Now, we are on the precipice of the 6th time in human history where China will be the world's most advanced country. This is a fact, whether they like it or not. And in fact, it's interesting to note that Forbes, that great symbol of US capitalism, published an article in 2011 titled "China's Secret Weakness," pointing to opium, which of course the British waged war on China 3 times in order to force the Chinese to legalize the use of opium so that Britain could get the Chinese masses hooked on the stuff. And guess how the Forbes family got their wealth? They got their wealth through the Opium Wars. So that great irony of this magazine printing an article like that. And of course, it was through this period of the Opium Wars that the US were able to carve new China areas which were Christianized and heavily Western, like Hong Kong. But in 1978, you saw a situation where the Chinese economy was worth only about 5% of the US economy. 80% of the Chinese population lived in poverty. And since that point in 1978, you saw a situation where China became the workshop of the world. It grew around 10% every year. And we are at the stage today where China is on the precipice of overtaking the United States as the world's #1 economy. And actually, the 20 fastest growing economies, none of them are European, and several of them are former British colonies. How will the US and Britain be able to adapt and respond to a world in which Anglo-Saxon dominance is not the norm? In fact, it's projected by 2030 that China will have 1/3 of the global economy as measured by primary purchasing power. It will be twice the size of the US economy and larger than the US and European economies put together. We have to remember that when we look at Britain, it's very insular in its thinking. It exports more to Ireland than it does to all of the BRICS nations combined. Can Britain adapt to a world where English may not be the lingua franca for business, and only 62% of the population, 62% of the population here can only speak English and nothing else? In fact, a 2014 YouGov poll found that 59% of the population believed that the British Empire was something to be proud of, and 34% believe it should be something that still exists. How can Britain adapt to a world that does not see things in the same way? How can humility be something that becomes part of British diplomacy? By pinning themselves to the United States and a projection of some sort of Anglo-Saxon power, the British government are going against the natural movement of history. China is surrounded by 400 US military bases. And I'll tell you something, when the US think about China, they would do very well to remember the 56,000 soldiers they lost in Korea and the 58,000 they lost in Vietnam. You're not toying around with Iraq or Afghanistan. You are toying around with major global powers. You have no right to gamble with our lives in this way. And even countries in the Five Eyes network, like Australia, actually their largest trading partner is China. Brazil, its largest trading partner is China. India, its largest trading partner is China. Australia, largest trading partner is China. Even you look at the Belt and Road Initiative and around 70 countries that are part of that. You look at the 16+1 that sees 16 Central and Eastern European states involved in the development of this shared project with China. In fact, in the current form, BRICS make up around 31.5% of world GDP. And if you add Iran and China to that, as seems inevitable, this would rise to 33% of the world's GDP. Britain is attempting to go against the natural movement of history with these wars which alienate and hurt millions and billions of people across the world. Our job here, as has been the job of anti-war movements in this city, is to make sure that we hold them to account and restrict their logic. We limit the parameters of what they are able to do. We hold them to account and we document their crimes, because it's not in our name that you will march us to our graveyards for the beneficiaries of Lockheed Martin and others. Thank you very much.